Good morning, bună ziua. I'm Jana Hainsworth, Secretary-General of Eurochild, and I'm sorry not to be with you today in Bucharest for this very important conference. Eurochild is a membership network that's fighting to put children at the very heart of what the European Union does. We want to make sure that European Union money and policies have a positive impact on the lives of children, and in particular the most vulnerable. EU money has played a big role in transforming child protection systems, and in particular in those countries which historically have relied on big institutional settings to take care of children in the care of the state. Together with Hope and Homes for Children, we established a Europe-wide campaign in 2013 called the Opening Doors for Europe's Children campaign, and in partnership with NGOs on the ground in different countries, we've been trying to keep track of how EU money is being spent and what can be done to ensure that the reforms that are funded by the EU actually serve the best interest of the child. Up to 2016, we worked in 12 countries, both in the EU, accession and neighbourhood region, in partnership with Hope and Homes. And in phase 2 of the campaign, we brought in new international partners and expanded the campaign to 16 countries, bringing in countries from Western Europe, knowing that deinstitutionalisation is not only a concern for Eastern European countries. But coming to the situation in Romania, and firstly I want to acknowledge both Hope and Homes and FONPC for organising this timely conference to review progress in Romania and to look to the future. Of course, we're at a very critical time in influencing how the next cycle of EU funding programmes are going to look. And it's very important that we look at what's worked, what hasn't worked, and what we should do differently in the next round. There's no doubt that EU money has been a major catalyst for change across much of this part of Europe, with hundreds of millions of euro being spent on deinstitutionalisation reforms. Within the Opening Doors for Europe's Children campaign, we're publishing fact sheets every year on the situation of children in alternative care. And it's clear that the numbers of children growing up in large-scale institutional settings has dramatically decreased, thanks in part to EU funding. So if we look at the situation in Bulgaria, for example, more than 160 million euros spent on deinstitutionalisation reforms, with an 80% drop of the numbers of children growing up in institutions, growing numbers of children in foster care, and fewer children being admitted into institutional care. Or in Lithuania, where the numbers of children placed in institutional care has more than halved in the last 2 years, and children under the age of 3 are never placed in institutions but rather placed in family settings and professional foster care. We welcome the commitment of the Romanian government to use over 100 million euros of EU funding to close old-style institutions. Romania has come a huge distance over the last 3 decades in transforming its child protection system, and with a strong focus on children's rights. And I want to acknowledge the work of the National Authority for the Protection of Children's Rights and Adoption in driving this change. But as we look to the future, it's really important to take an honest look at what has not worked and how we can learn from those mistakes. At the very core of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, which of course celebrates its 30th anniversary this year, is the concept that every child needs to grow up in a loving family environment to grow up to their full potential. And we need to acknowledge that we are extremely far from that reality across much of Europe. So spending money to close down large-scale institutions and move children into smaller settings, even if they aim to be family-like, must not be our ambition. We must aim for a full root and branch transformation of how children are viewed and treated in our societies, and how vulnerable children and families are supported. First and foremost, to prevent children from entering the public care system in the first place, and second, when it's absolutely necessary and in their best interest, that the care children receive is adapted to their individual needs. These are the 2 founding principles of the UN guidelines for alternative care for children. The principle of 1, necessity, and the principle of suitability. So what does this mean for the next generation of EU funds? We do like that the EU continues to require that member states put in place the right conditions before EU money is being spent. So this means that money needs to be spent in a more strategic and sustainable way than through ad hoc projects. But just requiring member states to have in place national strategies to reduce poverty risks it being a paper exercise without the right monitoring framework or accountability mechanisms. That's why we see the so-called Code of Conduct on partnership being so important. This partnership principle is part of the rules that govern how EU structural and investment funds are being spent. But I have to say that our civil society partners in the different member states have been quite disappointed about how this principle has been applied in practice in the last funding round. Involvement of civil society seems to have been more of a tick-boxing exercise than meaningful involvement in shaping how operational programmes are developed and implemented. But civil society has really important knowledge and experience that governments cannot afford to ignore. We want money to be spent in a way that actually makes a positive difference to the lives of children. And we know that when there's so much money at stake, there are always many different interests at play. So how do we ensure that the best interest of children and vulnerable families are actually at the forefront of the decisions that are made? There's no foolproof mechanism, but transparency and openness are absolutely critical. And we need to get as close as possible to the voices and experiences of children and families themselves. So I really welcome that across many countries there's growing attention and movement to involve children and adults and young adults who themselves have care experience, and a growing understanding of the need to involve vulnerable parents and families whose children are at risk or in the care system. It's these kinds of initiatives and support for self-advocacy that need to happen more and better if we are to get closer to doing the right thing for children. Romania now holds the EU presidency of the European Union, and it's fitting that they bring deinstitutionalisation reforms to the very top of the EU's political agenda, showing that the EU can really be a positive force for change. I trust that during this day you will have fruitful debates and learn the lessons from the last funding round and bring ideas to how we can shape the next generation of EU funding in such a way that we really have something to celebrate in 5 years' time. I look forward to reading your call for action and wish you the very best.